If someone comes up voluntarily to pay tax, right? Then rather than embrace the person, they now go for in-depth audit. That if you are declaring 100 million, how much more have you not? Instead of bringing the person on board and then working with that person going forward.
Yeah. The moment I get a KRP, now they'll be after me. Almost seeing this institution as an institution that is coming to rob me of my money.
But when someone comes and says my watch is worth 900,000, however rich you are, you surely cannot prioritize $1 million on a watch. That must be money you have not worked for.
Yeah.
And these young people are seeing that. They want to be like that.
Welcome to Politikali Konekted, a podcast on everything politics and governance in Kenya and Africa. Here, we unpack the complexities of policy, people, and power. I'm your host, Diane Angao,
aka Madam Speaker, and I am Chaka,
aka the Bishop. Today, we are joined with one of the best minds when it comes to corporate governance and tax administration. We have already gotten into the season of the finance bill, and we've had people unpack the difference between the finance bill 2024 and the finance bill 2025. This name would not be synonymous to you, but this gentleman started working for tax administration in the country way before even KRA was established. Professor Vincent Ongore is a seasoned tax and corporate governance expert with over 3 decades of practical work in tax administration and corporate governance. He's a prolific researcher and also an author of 2 university-level textbooks. In 2015, he was cited as top 100 cited scholars in Kenya. Now, this is a gentleman who really understands the complexities of tax paying, tax administration, and the politics in between. Professor Vincent.
Thank you, Diana.
Yes. Karibu sana to our podcast, and we are happy to have you. Maybe you can tell our guests a bit more about your 30 decades.
3 decades of work.
The 3 decades.
Yes, as Diana rightly puts it, my name is Vincent Ongore. I have a background in tax administration, corporate governance, and economics. As a young person, after college, I joined the then Income Tax Department of Treasury. Whole 4 years before Kenya Revenue Authority was created. KRA was created in 1995, effective 1st of July 1995. But before that, we worked under the Ministry of Finance, Income Tax Department. So I undertook a 2-year training program as a tax assessor, 91 and 93, after which I was deployed on tax administration. And my work in tax administration, I always say, has been the best of all worlds, because I've had opportunities both locally and abroad. I had opportunities to work both as a tax collector, a trainer, and also participated in
thought leadership
in the continent in the area of tax administration and research.
Yes.
As part of our culture here at Politically Connected, one of the first questions we ask all our guests what their earliest memory of political awareness, when they became aware of this animal called politics in one way or the other from a very young age.
Now, in 1978, I was 12 and in upper primary school when we lost the founding president, Jomo Kenyatta. And Jomo Kenyatta had bestrode our narrow world like a colossus for a while, and we did not quite anticipate that he would die and leave us. As a matter of fact, the then Attorney General, Sir Charles Njonjo, had made it a criminal offense to imagine the death of the president.
Yeah.
And so we actually believed that the president would be with us
Immortal.
Yes, and so when Mzee passed on, we got, that news. That news actually slowly but carefully sieved through for a while in harsh tones, because for some reason nobody wanted to be identified as the person who broke the news, because of that law that prohibited talking about the president's death, imagining. And so that was really the first time that I got very close to appreciating the importance of politics around us, because we were apprehensive. The country was apprehensive what was going to in the absence of this gentleman who had been the glue that was holding the country together.
Yeah.
And so everyone was expectant. We wanted to see what would happen. Of course, we were apprehensive. We didn't know what to expect. But yes, President Moi, the then vice president, was sworn in as acting president, and 90 days later, he became our president. And even then, we were not too sure, because the two personas were radically different.
Yeah. As a 12-year-old boy then, as you were thinking about Jomo Kenyatta, who seemed immortal, and then we have the emergence of Daniel Arap Moi, who was a different character, as you've said. What at that time, what were you and maybe your peers at that time perceiving of this change of power from now a president who we thought would never die to now a different character that emerges?
Clearly, some of us began to appreciate that the future of a nation was not entirely dependent on a person, an individual, but the collective will of the citizen. Because with Teacher Arap Moi taking over from a person who was obviously bigger than life and things moving on, then we began to appreciate that really there was something much bigger than an individual. And so for those of us who are beginning to be politically conscious, we're then appreciating that we all have a role. Everyone really has something that they can do for the country, and that the country was bigger than one person. And that's a lesson that we learned early. And for me, it's a lesson that has stayed with me, for the next 47 years. That I have been around after the death of Jomo Kenyatta. And I think it was a good thing that we picked that lesson, early enough in life.
Now, we definitely have quite a lot of questions. I'm wondering even where to start, but I'll pick up on that thread. You're 12 years old when the late Mzee Moi is becoming president, and you start working as an adult in the income tax department when he's still president.
Yes.
And one of the things I'm very interested to hear is that you then serve 3 successive administrations at the Kenya Revenue Authority.
Yeah.
And so you have essentially a front view, definitely even from the texts you've written, you have a front view of the evolution of our philosophy towards tax administration and fiscal policy. What can you tell us in a nutshell about the different approaches during those 3 administrations, which were quite different?
You're asking the right questions. Yes, indeed, I joined tax department on 12 August 1991. That was a Monday, and I remember it was my employment form was signed at 12:39 p.m.
Wow, I like that you remember the details.
By a lady called Miss Omia, who later to the UN. Now, under the tax administration appeared to be serving the presidency. And I say this with a lot of conviction, because immediately Moi left, we moved from, revenue collection of about 238 billion shillings to over 400 billion within one financial year when Kibaki came in. So which means that Mwai Kibaki understood that tax administration was about service to the people. That tax administration needed to be responsive enough to let people know that it was their money that was supposed to be mobilized to serve them, and to move us away from a situation where we were almost wholly dependent on offshore financiers for our budget support, we were beginning to appreciate that as a country, we needed stronger sovereignty and stronger financial independence. And that is a lesson that I picked, very early in the Kibaki administration. Actually, the first thing he did when he came in, he appointed MG as the Commissioner General. And I say this with a lot of, authority, because I worked very closely with Waweru. If you look at Waweru's book entitled Kenya's Tax, I'm actually the one who wrote at the back, and to more or less give authority to what Waweru had written in that book. So what Waweru did, the first thing that Waweru did when he came in, he first of all gave a message of hope to the country, picking it up from President Mwai Kibaki's message of tulipe ushuru tujitegemee. Mm-hmm. So Waweru came in, and the first thing he did was to declare tax amnesty. Tax amnesty, which means, we had situations where many Kenyans were not willing to pay taxes, either because they were not properly sensitized on their equitable tax liabilities. They were just not willing because they were not seeing a linkage between their taxes and service delivery. So we had piles and piles of interest and penalties, and say your equitable tax liability was 10,000. You don't pay, and in 10, 15 years, you have $1 million to pay, rising from interest and penalty. So you just say, I will not do it. So when the tax amnesty was declared, and people were told, pay your principal tax of say 10,000, and the rest of the 900,000 interest and penalties would be automatically waived. Mm-hmm. So Kenyans came up and they began to embrace tax administration, right? And we saw, revenue numbers going up in leaps and bounds.
Nice.
Right? And so for the 9 years that Waweru was the head of KRA, we saw beautiful things. And we actually entrenched a culture of tax paying, progressive, tax paying, and Kenyans, to a great extent, began to appreciate the linkage between their taxes and service delivery. Now, exit Mwai Kibaki, and in comes President Kenyatta. Yes.
Sorry, Prof. Before we head to Uhuru Kenyatta, I just had a thought come in. Yes. Because we really speak highly about, or rather not just me, but also other people online and in conversation, they speak highly about President Kibaki. Because we came from the backdrop after 2002, one of the first things he says, there will be free primary education. And at that time, it was more of like he announced it and he's told his people to figure out how we are going to ensure there will be free primary education. Now, coming from that background, you mentioned that Moi's administration was more like taxes was serving
the government, the big guys.
Yes. And now Kibaki makes this grand announcement once he becomes president, or rather it was part of his manifesto. How do you think they got to now this point of raising that revenue, or how did they manage once you make this executive order and then to finance the schools from the KRA perspective, that is? Taxation, as I've always said, is not an exact science. It's not physics where you do, rho GH is pressure in liquid, and then get the numbers and get the pressure. No. Taxation is hugely dependent on goodwill. And what Kibaki managed to do was to turn goodwill into act. Created the goodwill and promised Kenyans that if you pay your taxes, we are going to do this. And of course, he began to do it. And so Kenyans were enthusiastic because for the first time, they were able to see a link between their taxes and service delivery. And one of the things that you may have been too young to remember, but within a short time, we saw banks hawking money. Yeah. Banks coming to knock at your door to tell you we have this kind of money. This is what happens when you have enough money from taxes, right? Have enough money from taxes. It means government will not be increasing, interest rates to attract. Let me introduce you to open market operations, how treasury bills and bonds work. When the government lacks money, and it needs money to underwrite its development and recurrent expenditures, it does something called open market operation, where it issues treasury bills and bonds. Bills and bonds are issued
to borrow money from the public
Yes.
for a period, say 90 days, and upon maturity, that money is returned
Back.
Now, the issue here is that banks exist to create money, right? Now, normal citizens, right, would want to put their money in the bank as deposits, and then the banks would pay them interest on that deposit. But now for the government to get that money from Kenyans, it has to increase interest rates so that you are finding out, Chaka is asking, do I put my money in the bank and get 10% interest, or give it to government through the treasury bills and get 15%? So you are going to give it to government. So that means your government is raising interest rates to attract money from the public. That is domestic borrowing. Now, the trick is the moment that interest rate is raised, the financial sector will take a cue from it. So because that becomes the base rate for them. It is called risk-free rate, right? And so the interest rates in the economy will go up because of that single action of the government wanting more money and increasing, okay? Now, once interest rates go up in the country, you and I as business people will have no access to the banks, because when you get money, when you get a loan, you should be able to generate sufficient profits from your business to be able to repay the loan
And the interest.
Get the pay the interest, and also ensure that your business is operating. That we can't do. But now, what happened when taxes were coming in because of the goodwill that the government had created? There was no longer any need for government to increase interest rates, right? No need for government to increase interest rates. Government had enough money, and so it's not taking money from the public, right? At the same time, banks which were used to buying interest rates, right? Buying treasury bills and bonds, no longer could buy, and so because government was not selling, and so they were stuck with money. So that's why they were giving you the money. They were asking you to get the money because now the government is not asking for it. So they were stuck with bundles of notes. And that is the single thing that the Kibaki presidency did to this country. Prudent management of the financial sector to enable interest rates to come down, because there was no undue issuance of treasury bills and bonds and interfering with interest rates. That way, then we have more people accessing bank loans, more people money circulating and capital accumulation. People are creating jobs because they are doing business. And when you do that, then there's money to repay your debts. Right.
Did we see a lot of borrowing during the Kibaki era?
At one point in 2005, we got to a level where 97% of all our domestic requirements were taken care of through our domestic revenue.
97%?
97%.
That is incredible.
That is just before the plebiscite, the referendum. And that is why a lot of Kenyans have said that referendum thing was unnecessary. It actually interfered with the trajectory of the
country.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
So that is what happened. So essentially, we were getting just 3%, but which was not coming directly for budget support. It was for specific projects.
Right.
You said, supporting projects. And actually, people were begging the government, begging the president, allow them to support. As opposed to a situation under Moi where for over 10 years, we were not able to access loans, and we barely needed offshore loans to support our budget. Kibaki made Kenya proud, and of course that is why you hear it being said that at one point we were the most optimistic society in the world.
So what happens in 2013? Is there a radical shift, or is it gradual as we move to a situation where this money that is being saved by Kenyans in banks is going towards treasury bills? There's no access to credit, money circulating in the economy. We're getting to high debt dependence from foreign monies. We're using supplier finance, pending bills and the like. Is it drastic or is it gradual?
Let me conclude on the Kibaki issue. Kibaki had served in government his own training as an economist.
Yeah.
And experience as finance minister made it easy for him to understand what the country needed. And so he came in not to learn, right? But to implement his ideas about managing the economy. President Uhuru Kenyatta didn't have that luxury. He didn't have that benefit of knowledge and track record in government, operations. So he comes in, and both of them, both the president and his deputy, had no track record in government, in key decision-making sectors in government. They had been there, but of course more as politicians working and as technocrats who had grown in the government system. Remember that Kibaki was working towards being a professor of economics at Makerere when Mogi picked him and brought him to be executive officer of KANU, right? And so, and before that, he had participated in drafting the KANU manifesto. And therefore, the economic issues that we were dealing with at the nascent stages of our independence were things that were very clear to him. And he participated in implementing them. The duo of Kenyatta too and Ruto didn't have that benefit. And so they were learning as they were scaling the stairs. And therefore, did not, have that benefit. At the same time, we saw the goodwill
drop.
Because in the run up to 2013, there were a lot of, bad politics around the two. Remember the ICC issues and the rest of it.
Yeah.
And America particularly, and our other development partners, were particularly uncomfortable with them. And so the signals that they were sending to Kenyans and to the world were that here are two people who may not be very good for your country. And so remember the American ambassador at that time, I can't remember his name quite well now.
But the Undersecretary for Africa.
Yes, talking about
choices have
consequences.
Yeah.
And so the goodwill, with that statement, the goodwill, went. And then with the goodwill going, right, they started on a bad note, right? And their win was most unexpected. And now they knew that Kibaki had captured the attention of Kenyans.
Yeah.
They wanted to do something that would equally,
attract their attention.
Yes, and so they went the infrastructure
route.
As a matter of fact, my article for this Sunday, I have a column in The Nation.
Okay.
My article for this Sunday is about the infrastructure and how it has driven us to the debt trap. So they embark on aggressive infrastructure development as a way of, in their opinion, expanding the country. But with the benefit of hindsight, it was part of China's, debt diplomacy, because under Kibaki, China was a peripheral development partner. Kibaki has, had a history with the West. Attended
LSE.
University of London. Makerere was University of London anyway, because it was giving degrees of the University of London and LSE, London School of Economics. And so therefore he was a hard-nosed apologist for the West in terms of their economic models, development approaches. And so China was peripheral in that sense. But now China comes in because the goodwill from the West had dissipated for Ruto. And so China extends its debt diplomacy by coming in to talk about infrastructure, how they are going to support infrastructure development. And China, of course, doesn't attach a lot of conditionalities to its debt until you realize you are saddled with debt, right? And you are not able to, to repay it. Because as we talk, China now is the biggest creditor to the global South. And it is estimated that the global South owes China up to $1.1 trillion.
Dollars?
Yes, $1.1 trillion in debt, right? And so they come in, aggressive expansion of infrastructure. And of course, some of the loans that had been taken previously, maybe 30 years or so before, are now maturing. So they have to repay the loans. They are taking more, right? And that is the situation that in 2023, December, forced us to to drop what was then a debt ceiling of 10 trillion to adopt what we are calling debt anchor, which is 55% of the GDP. And that gives government sufficient leg room to maneuver in terms of getting more. The problem with it is that GDP is actually a moving target. Today we could have a bigger GDP as a result of a windfall, a good harvest, and then we get 55% of it. I mean, we are able to increase our debt acquisition to 55% of our GDP. Then the following year, GDP constricts. So we are in a situation where we have 55% of the previous GDP, but it could be 100% of the current. So that means we are then overexposed.
Yeah.
Right? So that is one of the things that we must deal with. Go back to the absolute figure of debt ceiling.
And on that issue of the correlation between debt and GDP, we have a situation right now, and would benefit greatly from your insight, where 70%, 69, 70% of revenue goes to debt repayment. And now you also have this debt anchor that you've mentioned. What are the implications of that in the long term, especially given a cash crunch that government is facing?
You know, that situation is actually very risky for us, because we have a situation where slightly more than 7 shillings out of every 10 shillings that we get from ordinary revenue being customs duty, income tax, VAT and excise, basically what KRA collects, goes towards debt repayment. So that means we have very little to apply to our productive sector: agriculture, manufacturing, construction, tourism, and everything else that helps an economy to grow, right? So what that means is that we will be struggling, and indeed we are already struggling with our even recurrent expenditures. Civil servants and other public sector employees, are on the streets, including doctors. Every other time, because their CBAs have not been respected. We have university funding models for students that is still in abeyance. We have professors on strike every so often. And really, we are not renewing. There's no renewal, infrastructure renewal. That means our infrastructure is getting dilapidated every single day. That means the country is not growing. We are not expanding our GDP because we have 2 choices: either to borrow more to repay the loans, right? Or simply to repay the loans from our domestic resources and do nothing at home. It is a precarious situation for us, and it is not going to be very easy until we make some very bold decisions.
Still on the question of implications.
Yes.
And I'll ask it from theory that I have.
Yes.
I have a theory that finance bills and our sort of fiscal policy still retains a colonial legacy of being more extractive than facilitative, because the colonialist was not aiming to build the African, it was to extract from the African.
And
given this fiscal pressure we are facing in terms of debt repayment and the urgency to repay, does that then inform an approach that is more keen and desperate to extract than to have the patience to build the economy and to facilitate the growth of enterprise, collect revenue in the long run?
An economy grows when funds are applied to the productive sector to expand our GDP, right? Create jobs, create enterprises, support enterprises, get more taxes to repay the loans, right? We have a situation today in Kenya where our fiscal policy is constrained by the realities that we are facing. Some of the realities are this. One, the tax administration reach is restricted to a great extent because we have a tax administration that is not in tandem with the business models, for example. Let me give you an example. I have been to there's a time I was in charge of taxpayer education for the entire Kenya. And I'm in Moyale, for example. You get people in Moyale get the animals from Ethiopia, for example, load them put them onto lorries and bring them to Dagoretti, to the abattoirs in Dagoretti. So far, there is no documentation there. So we are talking about a large proportion of our GDP being non-cash. When you're in a being cash.
Yeah.
When you're in a cash economy, traceability of financial transactions becomes difficult.
Yes.
Right? And therefore, the people who should be paying their taxes actually don't pay.
Yes.
And so we put pressure on the few
Who
compliant taxpayers, especially employees.
Mm.
And the tax burden increases on them.
Wait. Before we continue, I have a question for you who's watching. Why haven't you subscribed to our podcast? This is a podcast for everything politics and governance that concerns you. So hit the subscribe button. You can also hit the notification bell of our YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode. We're on YouTube, we're on Spotify, and we're on Apple Podcasts. You can find this podcast anywhere you want. And follow us on social media. We're on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and X, formerly Twitter. It doesn't cost you anything. It will take literally a minute. Make sure you also share this video because hii si kitu ya kuwatch peke yako. Share it on your WhatsApp groups and let's stay connected. Haya sasa, let's go on.
Look at the other example where someone brings in mitumba, right? 10 foot or 40 feet container, brings them into the country, takes them to Kikomba, to wholesalers, and then the wholesalers to retailers, and then KRA catches up with the small people with 10 pairs of shoes, right? Well, there's a guy there who is categorized as a hustler, but makes 3 million a day from that mitumba, right? So that means we need to invest in understanding the business models so that the tax administration reach, the net will be expanded to bring on board people who have, tax liability. And so they have a civic duty to pay. That is point number one. Number two is the malfeasance, associated with tax collection and the use of it. The tax collector, every time I went around training people on tax or sensitizing them, ask me, Vincent, how come typical tax collector appears to live better than us? That means Kenyans are already telling you that you guys are thieves. You are taking our taxes. That is an issue that we cannot hide away from.
Yeah.
And then once that money comes to the coffers, the state coffers, someone else with authority misapplies it. That's a polite way of saying
Misappropriation.
they actually dip their ugly fingers into the
pot
candy
that is
jar.
not theirs.
Yes, that is something that again Kenyans have to deal with. And then we have the question of tax administration structures. The world is moving towards machine learning capabilities in tax administration, AI and the rest of it. KRA has been sitting with data warehousing and business intelligence facility that's supposed to do their forecasting, supposed to help them, point to where tax could be found. But operationalization of that data warehousing and business intelligence facility is sluggish. And I think they don't even believe in it. And so we spend colossal amounts of money to put together facilities that we actually end up not using. And that means we are not getting the best or we are not optimizing the use of the facilities that we are, spending money on. The other thing is about globalization, which means entry into our economy of global players, multinational enterprises.
Yes.
With their different, activities and schemes, including, the so-called illicit financial flows. We have, all manner of schemes that are aimed at, minimizing their tax liability here. We have, Kenya is participant in the OECD framework for information exchange to tame transfer pricing activities. But we can't do much about it because of the vested interests of economies in the global north, because they're actually the owners of these multinational enterprises. And they're also the ones who are prescribing to us the frameworks for for transfer pricing approaches. So do you think they will give us everything we need to tax them?
Not at
No.
all.
And the
not
answer
at
is
all.
no. So we need to have our own homegrown frameworks for taxing multinational enterprises.
Yeah.
Right? You remember not long ago, and I'm happy to report I participated in it when we were talking about digital taxation.
Yeah.
And Uber, for example, for a long time they were taking money from us and not paying, at least until we came up with a way of ensuring that whatever you pay to the Uber guys, part of it goes to KRA directly.
Yeah.
But you remember they really complained and threatened to leave.
Yes.
That
they did.
means that multinational enterprises, right, are never interested in supporting the host economies. Especially
Yeah.
their interest is money, to make as much profit as possible.
As
And so
possible.
for us in Africa, we must always remember that we are on our own.
Sorry, Prof. I have a question based on
Yes.
the 3 points you said. One was about the cash economy and how
Yes.
sometimes our business model or our public finance policies are not directly, it doesn't address the current business models. So we've seen now, I'm just moving us into the Finance Bill 2025, that there's a proposal to have KRA kind of have access to individuals' data or companies' data, that kind of almost what people are saying that this is also now going to infringe Data Protection Acts. Do you think that this proposal is to address the traceability issue that KRA is grappling with in terms of tax liability?
The fact of the matter is that, just as I said a little earlier, taxation relies to a great extent
On goodwill.
on goodwill.
Yeah.
For as long as Kenyans see no reason to pay their taxes,
Yeah.
whatever it is that you do will not optimize tax revenues. All right? Because the government is still relying on the very Kenyans to implement what they're saying.
Yeah.
So I think the starting point for me is for the government to intensify taxpayer education approach that targets the mindset so that we have a progressive tax-paying culture. You know,
That's true.
Kenyans have their unique, or what we call cultural idiosyncrasies that determine how they pay their taxes.
Yes.
And until that is addressed, applying whatever it is that we want to apply may not optimize, revenues. But now, to address your question more specifically, the fact is that government is in between a rock and a hard place in terms of trying to raise and designing fiscal policy architecture that addresses, one, the revenue that they require, and two, the tax compliance. The tax compliance continuum has 4 aspects. There's the voluntary registration.
Yes.
There is, filing, there's declaration, and there's payment.
Yeah.
If we are able to achieve these 4 voluntarily, then we shall not need all that. We try to implement these things because we realize that Kenyans are really not willing to voluntarily discharge their civic responsibility of paying their taxes. Now, once you do this, right? Once you invade the space, globally, citizens are saying that they don't want too much government in their lives. They don't want a government that is intrusive.
And policing them.
They are better off doing these things voluntarily. And doing it voluntarily means that you have given them a reason to do it. Necessarily by linking service delivery to the taxes or taxes to service delivery. This, the use of technology to, for intrusion into citizens' lives, especially in areas that they consider to be their private spaces, is a pointer to the fact that government is desperately looking for that money. But that money is with government. Let me tell you, the money that government is looking for is actually with them. With them in the sense that, they are not taking enough steps to identify where the money is.
Yes.
They are essentially targeting those who have no ability to evade tax, right? While leaving those who have the capacity, right? And then we are misusing that tax. And a lot of times, actually, even deliberately budgeting for corruption.
Yeah.
Right. If we didn't do those things, we would have enough money. And then we ought to cut our clothes according to our sizes, to our size as a country. Right? It was no less a personage than His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta, who said Kenya during his time lost 2 billion a day to malfeasance. And that translates to over 770 billion shillings a month. So, I mean, a year, which is almost 30% or so of the budget.
It's double what is given to counties.
Yeah, so if you are losing, and you know you are losing almost 30% of your budget to corruption, right? That is basically what is called pilferage, theft by servant. But even beyond that, we, in our projects, we actually budget for to tech. So there isn't much going on, and there's a lot of money, right, that is going out, but nothing coming back. Because when government applies money to its productive sectors, it will be seen in terms of return from those sectors. And those returns will be able to generate sufficient taxes to repay the loans. And then we should be loan free. But we will talk about those loans and whether they are odious or genuine at some point. Yeah.
Prof, I have a philosophical problem.
Yes.
And it comes from a gradual realization that sometimes the government says very nice things and makes reference to very nice concepts like expanding the tax base. Very wonderful manifesto language. But I then wonder, when they talk about expanding the tax base, and in a sense that 80% informal sector being brought into the formal sector, and this goes back to my question of extractive versus facilitative.
Yes.
It would seem that the government is more focused on that traceability of cash more than facilitating systems to formalize these businesses. And in that sense, instead of focusing on productivity, it's still focusing on trying to see where they can almost, it's like catching the citizen, who has cash, as opposed to helping implement systems. Does the KRA even work with certain departments in terms of ease of doing business, in terms of setting up formal structures like through the business registration service? Should there be that sort of collaboration happening in order to actually then properly get this informal sector into the formal sector and then collect taxes?
This is something that we've been talking about over the years, that KRA itself doesn't seem to be interested in expanding that tax base. And let me give you an example. If someone comes up voluntarily to pay tax, right, then rather than KRA embrace the person, they now go for in-depth audit. That if you are declaring 100 million, how much more have you done? Instead of bringing the person on board and then working with that person going forward.
Yeah.
KRA goes to do in-depth audit for 5 years or more. Previously, we used to do it for 7 years. Now, the next person who was about to come up voluntarily will not come.
It's disincentivizing.
Yeah, because you have already shown
that
you are punitive.
Yeah.
You're not willing to. First of all, you have failed to get me. I'm coming out voluntarily, and then you're punishing me. So what is the signal? What is the message you are sending to others?
It's punitive.
KRA needs to have a progressive approach of working with those who come out to play their civic duty, paying their taxes, and then creating an enabling environment for people to for people to enjoy paying their taxes.
Yeah.
Right? When you come up with a very punitive tax system, a very punitive regime, then you're not helping to improve, tax compliance. It is worse that the tax codes are so complex.
Yes.
So sometimes people don't pay tax, not because they do not want to pay, but because they are unable to pay. We need to enhance taxpayer assistance so that those who are willing to pay but are unable to, some of them cannot get onto the various technology platforms. And in situations, for example, like in Turkana, where you have to climb onto a tree to even call your kin who is lucky to be in Nairobi. You don't want to line up at a cyber cafe for 6 hours to file your return.
Yeah.
They have better things to do. So I think KRA needs to make the fiscal environment more inhabitable. It's more friendly, so that people can pay their taxes voluntarily. And when they come out, support them rather than subject them to punitive measures as if they are enemies. We look at taxpayers as criminals instead of people who should be
Partners.
held
Yeah.
to be partners.
Yeah.
And so what we say sometimes is that what we do is at variance with what we say. And it is because we are not sensitized enough to understand that, tax administration is not a punitive exercise, right? But as you put it, we got it from, it's a part of the
masters.
colonial legacy that these Africans need to be beaten. But Africans are good people. Kenyans are very good. Let me give an example. In 1991-92 financial year, we introduced what is called self-assessment, a system of taxation, where you tell KRA, this is how much I got, and this is a check. When we were starting it, people were very apprehensive. But over the years, we learned that Kenyans have embraced it. Do you know that the UK sent their representatives here, Satoko, who stayed with us, and I remember training them in the 90s. And they started their own self-assessment system in 1996. We started ours in 91-92. But they are way ahead of us. Now we send our people to train. Yet we trained them.
What?
Yes. And in 2015, OECD ranking put Kenya ahead of South Africa in terms of technology. But we have technology
That we don't use.
that we don't use. And therefore, we actually, just wasting our resources on things that we have no interest in using. It's about mindset. Today, South Africa is way ahead of us in tax administration.
Yeah.
Especially use of technology. And yet we were ahead of them in 2015.
Yeah, I like what you said about mindset, and it's something maybe that we mentioned in our first episode when we were talking about civic education. And I could tell you, many young people, I myself included, when I first now became an adult and you asked for a KRA PIN, you almost want to delay that process, because how we saw it at that time, or I saw it at that time, is that the moment I get a KRA PIN, now they'll be after me. Almost seeing this institution as an institution that is coming to rob me of my money. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of young people, especially the ones we saw on the streets in June 25th, in June period, when they were rejecting the finance bill, the Gen Zs who have now come of age. Now, I'm wondering, how could we change that mindset? Because now is there an approach in terms of either entrenching tax education in the education system, and at how far down early in the education system could this sensitization start, so that by the time this person becomes an adult, they are appreciating the civic duty of paying taxes?
In my opinion, two issues. One is that young people are part of the society.
Yeah.
They see what Ongore and others have,
Yeah.
which they cannot account for. So they want to be, if Ongore has all manner of apartments wherever, everywhere in Kenya and elsewhere, and he doesn't seem to be answerable to anyone, why should I be subjected to a different standard?
It's a culture.
Yes. The second thing is about KRA working with its customers, not waiting until due date and then slapping you with a demand. When you apply for a PIN, they should be sending you messages every day, seasonally or occasionally, to talk about what you need to do, like banks do.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Banks do.
Yeah, this is what, now that you have a PIN, you are supposed to be doing this and that, right? So that people are empowered. But when you apply for a PIN, and KRA, and this is the word, catches up with you 5 years later, You don't have the information, you just apply it. So PIN should be seen as facilitative rather than, a tool that KRA uses to punish you, right? And really that is where the problem is, that we have many people who have some sort of income, right? But cannot voluntarily bring it forward because one, KRA doesn't partner with them to tell them that, this, people in Kibera, for example, are not aware that you find someone has 40 of those rooms in Kibera. But because those are slums, they are not aware that that 3,000 per room income is supposed to be subject to tax, because they say, we are in the slums. But a lot of guys who have houses in those slums are mid-level income and high income earners. So citizens really need to be walked through the steps of paying their taxes, why they need to. But then the ambivalence of the politician, where they preach what, drink the other wine. Thing. Is it called wine? This is bad for they send bad optics.
Yes, signals,
to the young people who would also want to, you can see I have a watch of 3,000 shillings. I can afford it. This one. But when someone comes and says my watch is worth 900,000, however rich you are, you surely cannot prioritize $1 million on a watch. That must be money you have not worked for. And these young people are seeing that. They want to be like
the red bottom shoes.
The red bottom shoes that I saw with.
Prof, there's something you've mentioned which is of great interest to us.
Yes.
And that is odious debt.
Yes.
But before we come to that question, allow me to ask this. Do we have a tax policy?
To be honest, there are two things that happen at the Treasury. One is that, yes, they have what they know is a progressive tax policy. But then they also have their needs for revenue, current needs. So a lot of times we keep shifting, right, to deal with
the needs.
And the biggest need, as we talk now, is to repay offshore loans, if they exist. The other one is to deal with the corruption that is inherent in open market operations, where specific banks collaborate with government, right, to design, the interest scheme, right, that is way beyond the reach of
common.
And what happens is, once they put those interest rates at that level, they are going to share the proceeds.
Wow.
What?
It is that simple. Because we need to have an interest rate scheme that reflects the fundamentals of our economy, right? You cannot charge money, to citizens who are operating within an economy that cannot generate it, right? And so specific banks, and this has been talked about, collaborate with government in some sinister scheme where they do open market operations, and this is those specific banks, and them, that buy those treasury bills and bonds in bulk, right? And they manipulate the interest rates so that after 3 months or so often when these instruments are being retired, they get billions from them. And so the government is essentially crowding out the other part of the financial sector, private sector, because the business, when the interest rates are so high and it's attracting everyone, including these particular banks, then there's no banking business that goes on. These guys just put their money in treasury bills and yet that the banking business is supposed to help citizens to access credit to enable them either start up or spruce up their operations of their enterprises. How are they going to do it if the banking sector is not doing banking business, right? So we are essentially pushing out the banking sector from doing their business. Instead of government concentrating on its traditional role or responsibility of creating an enabling environment for the private sector to thrive. They are doing business. Government does not do business. citizens
Do
or the private
business.
sector should do business.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word traceability.
Yes.
I studied law. I'm still a student of law. The learning doesn't end. In trusts law, there was this area known as tracing.
Yes.
And tracing was about, tracing funds and assets, especially they've been misappropriated.
Yes.
My question is, linking it to odious debt, does the KRA have a role in helping, or can they have a role in helping trace whether those funds actually came onshore, or tracing where those funds might be?
And how they were used.
The Constitution, we are talking about, the Public Finance Act and the Constitution are very clear on the offices that are mandated to do that. First is the Office of the Auditor General, and then the Office of the Controller of Budget. Right? Now, the Controller of Budget ensures that, rather should be able to confirm that monies that are borrowed, or money that comes into the exchequer and leaves the exchequer, is traced or is traceable. Now, we have a situation in Kenya where the government opened offshore accounts, and their argument then was that those accounts facilitate, the meeting of offshore or foreign obligations. You don't need to bring money here, so you borrow and put it in those offshore accounts, and then when they
Pay them.
yeah. So the point is that money that is borrowed should come to the consolidated fund.
Yes.
When that happens, two benefits arise. One is that we are able to trace the projects to which those funds have been applied. But two, money goes to the productive sector and helps to generate revenues that are then used to repay those loans. So we don't have to borrow to repay. But if you keep the money out there, like Auditor General is telling us in 2021, 2022, both Auditor General and Controller of Budget, that 1.13 trillion shillings they are reporting did not come to consolidated fund. And so they are not able to trace what it did, and it did not have the benefit in the economy.
And we still have to repay it.
And we are repaying it. So that is why people are raising questions that it is possible we are repaying odious debt. Now, what is the easiest way to resolve this problem? Easiest way to resolve the problem is Treasury give us the debt book. Then the Auditor General says Treasury refused. So why are they not giving the Auditor General and Controller of Budget the debt book? It is because either these things were done in a shadowy manner, or they did not exist at all in the first place. So we are literally paying debts that either don't exist, or we completed payment, or that went into people's pockets. Because if it was, something that is clear and open, why do we hide the books?
Yeah. Wow. So that's a very good question. And I'm sure a lot of people may not understand the complexities of this odious debt, because it's a conversation, when it comes to public finance, it seems to be a conversation that is left to economists. And then only when the finance bill comes around and it touches into my pocket is when now I come out, or other people would come out and either protest or embrace. Now we are here in 2025, and we said about 70%, out of 10 shillings that is collected, 7 goes to financing debt. What sort of because we see the young people are very, can I say, anxious and ready to be, what kind of civic action? Because, if we continue, from what I'm learning from you here, is that if we continue in the same trajectory without asking the right questions and finding the answers to these complex issues that we find ourselves, that we are going to keep finding ourselves in this very vicious cycle where we can't get out of, in terms of our economics of our country. So what are some of the right questions people in our audience can ask so that there's some sort of level of accountability and transparency? I'm just asking to empower them.
About 2 weeks ago, The finance bill was shared.
Yeah.
Parliament, National Assembly platform, Parliament platform, website.
Yeah.
And at that point, it was done to attract comments, proposals, suggestions, right? Now, what is obvious is that no specific figures were attached. And you know why? Because they fear the...
They have trauma.
Yes, of last year.
But this is not the way we want to go as a country, right? Now, the Finance Bill 2024 had proposed to raise additional 360 billion shillings to deal with our debt, offshore debt, and also to handle our domestic issues of development and recurrent
Expenditure.
Now, that was suspended by the agencies. But that does not mean that our responsibilities were equally suspended.
Yes.
Now, John Mbadi, CS Treasury,
Yeah.
tells that this bill will not be addressing additional tax revenue raising issues, or measures, and that is more interested in structural
loopholes,
changes
yeah.
and modernizing KRA.
Expanding.
Yes, to ensure that, we get more taxes. Now, that approach is interesting in the sense that the issues that he's suggesting are novel, they are good, but they will take time. Some of the modernization initiatives that were taken in the early 90s are beginning to bear fruit now, right?
30 years later.
Staff rationalization of ICT platforms or technology platforms. Because the key thing is the mindset of Kenyans. There's more money because the money is actually out there. We are simply not picking it.
Yeah.
Because Kenyans don't want to give you, you're not giving them reason to give you the money.
Yeah.
And we are not investing in understanding the kind of businesses that Kenyans do. Now, when we do not raise additional taxes, we will not get out of the debt trap. When we raise additional taxes from Kenyans, the way it is now, we will leave Kenyans with nothing to save.
Yeah.
And nothing to invest and generate more income.
Yes.
The issue then is, what can Mbadi do?
Yeah.
Let government come out honestly.
Yeah.
And tell Kenyans that we want to do this revenue raising measures for this period, whether that is 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. This is the amount we expect to generate, and then we stop it and put it in law. We legislate it, right? Because we have trust issues with government.
Yeah.
And let government also come out and tell us, this is the state of the economy. It is wrong for Mbadi, for example, to be telling us that we are improving. We are not improving. We are not. If we were improving, today our children in school would have their bursaries.
Yeah.
Our counties would have their money.
Yes.
Doctors and nurses would not be on strike. CBAs with public servants
enforced.
Would have been, obeyed.
Pending bills.
So we actually don't have money, and we don't have money because we are repaying debts. And two, that we are budgeting to steal. And that has been on for a long time. And that is why, for me, I have suggested in some of my writings that we should adopt a zero-based budgeting.
Yeah.
Where we sit here and say, this ministry, what exactly do you need this year? This is the salary. This is what we want to do. This is what we want to do. Instead of saying that last year we had 10 billion for this ministry, let us add % because prices have gone up. Because if that 10 billion included the budgeted corruption, so we are increasing the budgeted corruption by another 10%. This is what we should. And the moment we embrace the zero-based budgeting, we cascade it to the zero-based tax revenue setting, so that we ask KRA to set targets based on the fundamentals of the economy. Because the moment you saddle Kenyans with more taxes, there will be a very high tendency to evade the tax.
Yes.
Right? But a zero-based approach would be rational. This is what we need based on the cascaded figures from Treasury. And so we don't have wild, expectations. And when we don't have wild expectations, it means we have realistic expectations that Kenyans can now deal with. But we must come out with proper information to Kenyans right? And reduce, pilferage, theft in government, reduce the budgeted corruption, be forthcoming with the information about what we need to do to reduce our debts, right? Because as it is now, Kenya can only obtain syndicated loans, which means that many institutions coming together, right, to give a loan because one of them fears the risk, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we are spreading the risk. We are spreading the risk because one, our debt to GDP ratio is already very high. Our tax to GDP is already very high. And so chances of default are high. That is why now what they do is in a syndicated framework, the interest alone could be slightly higher than the capital you are getting, the loan itself, right? And you pay it before you start repaying the loan itself. So that in case you default, you shall have repaid it anyway. And that is what, and that makes it extremely expensive. So there's even more pressure for revenue because we are getting more expensive loans, more pressure. And, we need more taxes. We need to increase, tax raising measures. And that is why I suggested that we need a bipartisan, caucus of parliament to look through the tax bill. The finance bill 2025 to identify possible revenue raising measures. Particularly, our traditional, tax raising measures have been what we call the sin goods. Sin goods are cigarettes, wine, beer, and all that. So we toy around with, with rates, excise duties to make sure, because of course we target sin goods because of what we call inelastic demand. Inelastic demand in the sense that if you increase beer by 5 bob, it is possible, it is very likely that whoever takes beer will continue taking it. Yeah, but if you increase the price of an egg, if it is not very essential, someone will drop it, right, from the menu. But for beer, cigarettes, and wine, and the rest of those, people will still... Lifestyle. Yeah, so it is those goods with inelastic demand that have traditionally been the targets of tax administration for raising additional taxes.
And you've mentioned Parliament. And
yes.
Before I come back to that,
yes,
actually, you touch on something very interesting. And it's why part of why I was asking whether we have a tax policy. Because in addition to taxing the sin goods, it seems a lot of emphasis is on consumption taxes.
Yes.
Does that betray also a mindset issue in terms of our policies in not focusing on productivity? And we've often discussed that we have a sense that Western nations would prefer that we remain consumer economies so that we can be a dumping ground for their goods other than being productive economies. So does that focus on, or is it a myth that we focus on consumption taxes, or an assumption?
The issue you're raising is a very interesting one. Today, it is an offense to keep your own seeds and regenerate them.
Yes.
And yet, if you look at what we call the environmental and ecological footprints, in other words, in our production, in our value chain, in other words, how we mess up with our soils using chemicals to produce the foods that we eat. Those chemicals have been prescribed to us by those very guys. And they know that over time, Kitale, for example, is no longer productive. So once that happens, you now begin to be reliant on them. And they are telling you, we are giving you seeds that you cannot regenerate. So the issue of food, someone who controls your food controls you.
And they have a patent on the one sell to you.
Yes. Now, that is a fact that Africans have allowed themselves to be controlled up to their kitchens.
Yeah.
Right?
In their own homes.
And this is deliberate. It is deliberate, and it is painful that we in this part of the world cannot control any aspect of our life. Everything we have surrendered, even our brains, to people. Now, regarding a tax policy that addresses the productive sector, the short-termism, the now mindset, we want the money now. We are in a democracy where every 5 years people want to come in and others must leave. Okay? And so someone wants to amass as much wealth as possible.
As possible.
And that is what they have learned from their predecessors. Right? Because our punishment regime is not punitive enough. Right? And so people want to get as much money as possible within the 5 years because they do not know whether they are coming back.
It's our turn to eat.
So it is our turn to eat in 5 years. So investing in the productive sector that will give us money in the next 15 years doesn't serve the interest of politicians who want money now. And so until we embrace civic duty, right, to understand that we do it for posterity,
Yes.
that will never happen. And it is a pain that Kenyans have to live with for as long as we do what we do. Because you know this is a bad person, but that person is your village mate. And therefore, I will vote for this bad person because he will bring money home.
But is that really true? Do they really bring money home?
Now, it's a perception that
It's
they
a
bring
perception
money
that they do, because just because someone of my tribe is in a certain part of government, I don't think I've ever on the table now felt like, yes, it is because this person is deputy president or president that now we can eat chicken.
Let me tell you something. In 2012, I was in Kuala Lumpur. I had gone there on a private visit, but while there, we had two very progressive Kenyans at our embassy in Kuala Lumpur. There was Samorio and Wagema, deputy. Samori was the High Commissioner, Mr. Wagema was the deputy. So they were able to facilitate us to meet Mahathir Mohamad, the founder of the progressive Malaysia. The guy who, you remember, came out of retirement when Najib was messing up Malaysia. And he threw away, kicked out Najib, and right?
Yeah.
Now, I had very precious 45 minutes with Mahathir Mohamad in his private residence in KL. And he told us, look, gentlemen, we in this part of the world, and by this part of the world he meant the global south, including us, Southeast Asia and Kenya, have always looked for other people to blame. And yet we have what it takes to change. I was prime minister for 22 years in this country. And we made a tremendous difference in the lives of our people. At that time, he had retired when I was talking to him. And he said, look, we developed Vision 2020. But already in 2012, right, we have achieved the 2017 targets. And we are marching steadily towards the first world in our lifetime because of deliberate decisions and steps that we took, including reforming tax administration and making it very punitive to engage in corruption. And he said, I'm a medical doctor, he told us. I'm a medical doctor. I have been prime minister, but I have 2 houses. And I've told government if they find a third one, take it. One that I bought with a mortgage, which I serviced for 15 years. And the other one that I have just built with my pension. 2. I am sure you know MCAs who are richer than that.
Yeah.
Said our interest was to ensure that the house girl can go to the same hospital as her boss and get the same quality
of service.
Health. All right. And he says, I do not want to go anywhere else. If I'm sick, I'm treated here. Because I ensured that we delivered on the health sector. Why can't we do it? I mean, I meet people who tell me, Vincent, you worked in KRA for 30 years. You don't seem like you are a billionaire. We know colleagues who are billionaires. And I tell them, as they were doing what they were doing, if they did it, I was in school. And so I'm able today to teach at the University of Colorado at Boulder and to be paid and to be given money to go and advise a country, for which I'm paid handsomely, as they retire and go home and die. Because sometimes you die. Sometimes you die as a result of overconsumption of your own wealth.
Yes.
Yeah. Right? That causes death.
Yes, it does.
Because you just wake up and eat and eat again and eat. Nothing. So we have an opportunity as Kenyans to make a difference. And that difference, we already saw that Gen Zs have what it takes to put the government on the edge. And so we must not relent. Let us seek to engage with government all the time. You people who are young, you have the energy, and you don't have, entanglements in government
Yeah.
that will make you fear, right? And so for me, it can't be business as usual for a very long time, because as you can see from the Finance Bill 2025, we are not raising additional.
Any revenue.
So we have to think. We have to be more innovative in terms of how we are going to raise taxes, how we are going to raise revenue without increasing taxes.
While paying odious debt.
Yes, and those odious debts must go
Yeah.
at some point, because if Kenyans don't want you to tax them more, right? You must engage with Kenyans and tell them, look, Diana, we want you to give us. One of the things that is being suggested today is that we should look at the debts that government owes citizens,
Yes.
and then turn them into equity,
Yeah.
which can then be traded. That will help government to, release the pressure, will release pressure on government to pay the debts.
They did that with pending bills, a bit, 100
Yes.
billion worth.
Yes, and the thing is, you have to give Kenyans reason to buy. They have to develop confidence in your ability to pay when it falls due. Right.
Yeah. I'm seeing from what we're learning from you in this episode is that it's all connected in terms of, we say that we're here to unpack the policy, the complexities of people, policy, and power. Now, from what I've understood and what I've learned from you, and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom, is that, first of all, it starts with the people in terms of goodwill. And the goodwill is not just from the citizens, it's also from actually the policy implementers and the policy makers. There must be a mindset shift. And then now down to also the policy, there has to be a policy that actually matches the business models of the day. And then down to the people in power.
Yes.
It has to stop being about short-termism. What you're saying, that in 5 years I must amass this amount of wealth. I actually had experience working in a county government. And when I transitioned out, I've been telling my colleagues that I believe devolution was one of the greatest gifts. However, the people who implemented devolution also implemented a blueprint of corruption.
Yes.
So now we have new governors coming into office and are implementing this. Instead of the blueprint of devolution, they're implementing the blueprint of budgeted corruption. That's making such a vicious cycle that now, even I was seeing some conversations online where Kenyans are like, why do we even need these counties? Because all what they're seeing is the fruits of corruption. They're not actually understanding what devolution and the promise that devolution is supposed to give them. So I'm very inspired by the wisdom you've shared here, but also I'm left with bigger questions in terms of me, myself as a citizen, and the role I play in public finance and our economy in a whole. Because I wouldn't want to leave this earth and leave my grandchildren with so much burden and didn't have the chance. So, Prof, we've come to the end of our episode, and maybe we could ask you for a parting shot. One last thing that you'd like our audience to take home, if they were to take on just one thing that you have shared.
As citizens, we have a civic duty, and that civic duty is to do the right thing.
Yes.
Right? And we have to question government on why they want money if they can't use prudently what they already have, what we have given them. That is a question that every citizen must ask, because it is our responsibility to do so.
Yes.
Thank you.
I am left wondering, in addition to being very inspired, I'm left wondering, as you mentioned, that being a global citizen, you're advising foreign governments, and, your formative career years, spent 3 decades serving 3 administrations. I'm left wondering, does government think to benefit from the insights of Kenyans such as yourself, who clearly have love for country and have served country and are clearly still willing to serve country?
Politics of the day, the sort of politics as we know it in Kenya, it's largely selfish. And what you're advising them to do is exactly what they do not want to do, because then it would be pricking their conscience that we are doing the wrong thing, right? You don't want someone reminding you that you are doing the wrong thing, because that is not your objective interest, right?
With that, we need to take a long, hard look into the mirror. And that includes our leaders. That includes us as citizens. We need to start asking ourselves very difficult questions. We have a tendency to ask a lot of our politics and what we expect from it, but do we ask ourselves enough of what we expect from ourselves? We have such great minds in this country who are willing to unpack for us what the real issues are, but do we take the time to ponder, to consider, to reflect, and then to implement those insights that we gain? This has been another episode of Politically Connected. Thank you for joining us, and see you soon on a screen near you.
Asante. Asante.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wow,
I appreciate it.
Please, can we have you back?
Did I go?
No.